Meeting to order. Okay, we'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. There are no agenda updates. I'll ask the clerk to call the roll, please.
Mr. Gurl.
Present.
Mrs. Gorel.
Present.
Mr. Hoffman.
Present.
Mr. Kelly.
Here.
Mr. McDonald.
Present.
Mr. Neighbors.
Present.
Mrs. Red.
Present.
Mr. Salgado.
Present.
Mr. Schultz.
Here.
Mr. Tassani.
Present.
Mr. Webster.
Here.
Mr. Westcott.
Present.
Mr. Arena.
Here.
Mr. Billich. Mr. Billich. Mr. Boomer. Mr. Booker.
Here.
Mr. Butita.
Here.
Mrs.
Lord, thank you for this day. We ask you watch over all Winnebago County employees and their families. Please remember all military, police, and EMS workers in this country. Give this board the wisdom to do the best, which will affect all in the county. Amen. Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Our next item of business, public comment. Jim Phelps. Mr. Phelps, are you here? Come on up, Mr. Phelps. Our first speaker is Jim Phelps to talk about company's efforts to eliminate plastic bags. In favor, I'll read a quick disclaimer. Comments shall be limited to 3 minutes. Speakers may not address a zoning matter which is pending before the ZBA, zoning committee, or county board. Personnel matters or pending or threatened litigation may not be expressed in open session. An individual may speak a maximum of 3 times per calendar year on the same topic. This prohibition shall include the repetition of the same topic and a statement of what is purported to be a different topic. Personal attacks or inappropriate language of any sort will not be tolerated. With that, Mr. Phelps, thanks for joining us.
And thank you for allowing me to address this body. My wife and I own Phoenix Traders at 215 for about 16 years now. But 4 years ago, we instituted a voluntary plastic bag ban on our own accord because we go to third world nations where single-use disposable plastics are an environmental disaster of unbelievable proportions. I'm really here to tell you what the outcome of our 4-year experiment has been, and it's been incredibly positive. I think it's been a very good point for our business. Everyone seems to understand what we're doing. No one's upset when I tell them about our policy. We do have 2 sets of bags for sale, much like they do in Europe. I haven't sold very many, to be very honest, except for our recycled newspaper bag, which helps a program in India for street kids. But what I'm impressed about this was just how positive it's been, and this has been a voluntary experiment. We received a sustainability award from the county, and thank you very much, and also the past chairman in November. within the business. But what I would hope you would listen to tonight is that I was just made notice by Forbes magazine 2 days ago. The European Union just instituted a single-use plastic ban on all sorts of single-use plastic items, forks, knives, styrofoam containers, and of course the plastic bags that Mr. Girl was talking about. What's really bad about the plastic bags, and I think Mr. Girl's tried to explain, is that they're what are called oxo materials. They're meant to oxidize and break down, and that's part of the problem, is that when they break down into micro particles, which of course pollute the entire water stream, and also are starting to show up in some of the animals we eat as well. So it's high time that we start thinking about doing this for a whole host of reasons. You know, we are caught up in the momentary things of things here in the county, but I think we need to look long term at what we're going to leave as a legacy to the citizens of not just this county, but this state and this union as well. And to me, it's kind of sad, having lived in Germany for a couple of years, that we're this far behind the Europeans. Since we led a lot of the clean air initiatives, like introducing catalytic converters, which helped our air pollution back in the 70s, the Europeans had to adopt this. So I hope you would take Mr. Grill's thoughts about this very seriously. And lastly, if you can't come to an agreement that maybe this should happen, can you at least come to a resolution suggesting to businesses that this be voluntary? That's an easy first step that you can make as county board members. Thank you very much for your time this evening. I hope you have a
I'm here with John Guler, our finance officer and Army Vietnam veteran, and Jackie Hull, our secretary, a Navy veteran. I am also a Vietnam retired Army veteran myself. The VAC's mission is to provide assistance to needy Winnebago County veterans and their families. We are here tonight because the VAC 2019 budget, as requested by us in August 2018, has been underfunded by approximately $100,000. Our fiscal year 2019 budget, as provided by the county board, is not even enough. If this budget is not fully funded soon, we cannot continue to provide assistance for our veterans. This is the second month in a row that our request for full funding has not come before this county board meeting. We also need to point out that our organization is primarily governed by state statutes, 330 ILC 45, and by an intergovernmental agreement adopted by this county board in June of 2016. Please note, this county board has not complied with this statute or with our IGA concerning our budget. In order to continue our missions assisting our veterans, as per statutes and our IGA, it is imperative that we seek resolutions as soon as possible, please. Thank you for allowing me to speak tonight.
Thank you very much, sir. I appreciate your service.
Thank you.
Chairman. I'll follow up. I think I had Mr. Webster and then I have Mr. Hoffman. Mr. Webster.
Thank you. To A.C. Davis' question there, my question would be, are we in arrears? I'm asking.
So far, no. But if we hit the 6-month mark, we will start to be in arrears, yes.
Okay, now my next question is, do we have time frame on our next regularly scheduled budget update for this?
Carla?
They were actually provided consistent funding with the last few years, and they've had run at a surplus. They're asking for additional money this year compared to prior years. It would eat into their fund balance.
However, this year is less than last year. We were granted less than last year.
Correct, and you had a
Correct.
surplus last year, and we made it equal to what your tax levy is.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I do believe this is a discussion in committee at this point, so this is a discussion that will be taken up in committee in the next meeting. I see Mr. Salgado shaking his head yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Webster. Mr. Hoffman, you're good? Thank you. That concludes our comment portion of the evening, so thank you for that. Next item of business would be meeting minutes. May I please have a motion to approve the December 13th, 2018 minutes and to lay over the January 10th, 2019 minutes. I have a motion by Mrs. Crosby. May I have a second, please? I need a second. Thank you very much, Mrs. Rudd, Mr. Boomer, and Mr. Hoffman. Item is now before the board. December 13th on approval, layover of January 10th. Any questions on the minutes before the board? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Minutes are approved. Thank you very much. Next item of business, announcements and communications. Clerk Gahn.
Mr. Chairman, the items listed below were received as correspondence.
Okay, we will place those on file. Thank you very much, Clerk Gahn. Next item of business, board member correspondence. Any comments by board members? Seeing no hands up, we'll move on to the chairman's report. I got 2 items tonight. Couple things. A lot of discussions about ordinances. A lot of discussions about workflow. How do we work together as a county? How do we work together between the county, the administration and the board, administration and committees, administration and department heads and our board? A lot of discussion around that. I agree with a couple of the board members in a recent discussion, I believe in the operations committee with Mr. McDonald's committee. The solution is, I believe, what's under item 10A and B. It is to move forward aggressively with very rigorous discussions in the coming month. Now that we've gone through a shared values and a strategic planning process, which is new for us, now all of the work's done to include our community, our partners internally, our employees, county board members. We had a retreat on that, department leadership. It's to focus on 2 things. Number 1 is now bringing that work, all of that work by all those people over all those months back to our committee and to talk about shared values, to talk about the adoption of our strategic plan. Yes, a lot of work has gone into that. We have 5 values that we're going to be talking about that I believe if we had a serious, in-depth discussion and we didn't look at this as, hey, this is something I'm going to take and beat over someone's head when I'm mad at them, but this is something that I as chairman, and we ask our employees, we ask our board members, we ask our partners, these are the 5 things we're going to look in the mirror and say, we're going to try to live by. I'm very committed to that conversation. I appreciate Mr. McDonald's leadership in saying, let's have that discussion in my committee. He's asking for, when information comes out to the whole board, after the end of all this work with some new board members, let's have that. So he's going to be in communication with you about that. And I think if we adopt those 5 values or tweak it, but find our 5, the 5 we're going to live by, I'm in. I'm all in. The second is our strategic plan. There's 5 areas of focus that after listening to the board and many of our partners, that we said these are the 5 things that we want to focus. And we know that our budget's a reflection of our priorities. Every discussion we had should be tied to one of these 5 core areas. Let's have this discussion and bring this thing home and make sure we're clear. Alignment is going to be the way through. Living by these 5 values and saying, are these the 5 things that we want to base every discussion we have on in terms of focus the next 3 or 5 years? I think that will do a ton of bringing clarity, increased alignment, and energy as we go forward, and I'm very excited about that. With that, I will turn things over to Carla. There's a couple of items, and forgive me here, she's been out of town on vacation, just got back here late.
or any support for the number that they are quoting, so we'll look for that in the future. We've been working with the landfill in order to have an audit done to determine that the amount that they're saying we've been overpaid is really accurate. We asked for a narrative of how they calculate and how they determine what is exempt waste. We asked for that before the holidays and are still waiting on that narrative in order to develop our procedures to perform the audit. I followed up with them and they said they're still working on it, so I'll continue to follow up with them. And then I'd like to turn it over to Brett Frazier, our Animal Services Administrator. He has a brief update for us.
Before we do that, we'll bring you up in a second, Brett. Mr. Salgado.
Yeah, just a quick question for you, Carla. On some of these, like the Rockford Election Authority, from a county standpoint, audit, are we liable to be recording this as a potential liability? And if so, when would we expect that?
I'll defer to Molly. I know that she did discuss that with the auditors. Yeah. It's not certain enough, I think, that they were going to record it. As well as the landfill overpayment. We won't be recording that yet.
Thank you, Mr. Salgado. Mrs. Crosby.
Quick question. I have in my hand a letter from Geyer and Eichen dated August 28th regarding this election fees. And I've got an accounting of the calculation, the County Board of Election and the payments that have been forwarded to the county. So I don't know why you don't have it, Carla.
I do have it, but it's numbers on a spreadsheet without any support for how they determine.
The city's asking us to participate in the bank, and at the same time, they're demanding a large pot of money from us there, so I thought the timing was a little poor on that. That's for another time, thank you.
Thank you. Just to follow up on that, I got a call from a reporter about a week ago. I do not know I do not believe that was driven by any public entity. It was a follow-up on a previous story from when I think that initially was talked about, just so we're clear in the room. Thank you, Mr. Webster. Any other comments? Mr. Frazier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, happy to be here with you folks. I had hoped to have our new shelter veterinarian here to introduce her to you. She had a family situation come up and she couldn't be with us. Originally a native of northern Chicago suburbs, and just after she graduated vet school at the University of Missouri, she actually worked here at a veterinary clinic in Rockford for about a year before she went to Florida and ran a shelter medicine program there. And then we got her out of a high-volume spay-neuter operation out east. We are very excited about what she adds to our team at Animal Services. One of the big things that we are focused on is decreasing the amount of time that animals at our shelter spend at the shelter. And part of that is eliminating bottlenecks, places where animals get caught up and stuck. One of those right now is spay-neuter surgery. As you know, and as we're proud to do, every animal that leaves our shelter is spayed or neutered so it can't increase the pet population. But right now, oftentimes, even in our slowest period of the year, a spay-neuter is the thing that holds an animal up and adds 2 or 3 days to their length of stay. We are going to be working hard to train our veterinary team as well as we've trained our kennel team here in the last few months so that we are a well-oiled machine when we hit our busy season here come April or May. Dr. Les will be a huge part of that, working with our other supervisors and our other staff, not just to add the things that she brings, but also to teach our existing staff new skills, new ways of doing things, and better ways not only to serve the pets in our shelter, but also to serve the people of Winnebago County. So I'm sorry she couldn't be here with us. We'll get her back to another board meeting. But feel free to stop down anytime, and don't be offended if we try and send you home with a dog or a cat. The other thing that I wanted to mention, and it is a little bit later on the agenda, we are looking at doing a fairly major renovation to the larger dog kennel room at Animal Services. We are always looking for ways to be more efficient, but also to increase the welfare of not only the animals at the shelter, but also the welfare of the people who work at the shelter. If you've been in our large dog kennel room, you would not recognize the kennels that are in there as something from this century. They're 3 feet tall, they're and chase a dog or to clean. The only way to operate transfer doors, which allow us to safely handle bite animals, is to climb on top of metal bars and operate manually large sheets of stainless steel. Tonight we went to committee and now it's before the county board to do a renovation that will allow us to have working transfer doors, double-sided kennels, and will improve not just welfare for animals, but also the safety and welfare of our staff. This is important too because now if you come to the shelter, you can walk into both of our kennel rooms. Right now we have 35 dogs at the shelter and 31 are available for adoption, even though about half of them are on their stray period. If you come to the shelter now, you can see any animals are seen by the adopting public again to help us drive down our length of stay, and that's the way we're going to run an efficient department. So just a couple of things I wanted to share with you tonight. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Brett. You're doing a great job. We appreciate everything you've put in place since coming aboard. Any other comments from the administrator's report or any other administrative comments? Thank you. Thank you very much, Brett. Thank you, Carla. Next item of business would be the approval of the consent agenda, which includes the raffle report and the bills. May I please have a motion? Thank you, Mr. Hoffman, second by Mr. Fellers. Consent agenda, including the raffle and the bills, are before the board. Any questions by board members? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Next item of business, standing committee reports. First item is the Personnel Policies Committee. Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The first item up is an ordinance, an elephant in the room, I guess, and that's an ordinance amending Section 2 of the County Code of Ordinances, and it's been previously read in, and I so move.
We have a motion by Mr. Fiducia on ordinance amending Section 2, sections of Chapter 2 of the County Code of Ordinances. May I please have a second? I have a second by Mr. Boomer, a second by Mrs. Gorel. Item is now before the board for discussion. I guess I would just start by asking Mr. Fiducia to overview the changes in what, I guess, what is currently to what will be, if that's okay.
That's right.
Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have what we call a township form of government. And that township form of government, what I, in my investigation, found that the the chairman reports to the county board. The administrator would report to committees on the county board, and basically nothing I don't think would be changed except that, and that would be tweaked very simply.
Thank you. I'm going to come back, Mr. Fiducia. I just wanted to clarify one thing. The comment was made about the elephant in the room ordinance before the board about the idea of the county board chairman being the 21st member of the board. Can I just get a clarification on that, Mr. Kurlinkus? I believe in the ordinance I'm specifically not a member of the county board. Is that?
A member of the county board.
And I believe that's also how it is in McHenry County, which just went to a similar model as we have. Mr. Fellers, and then I'll come back. Mr. Fellers.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A quick question for the state's attorney then. As the ordinance is in the statute for a township style government, is it also not the fact that the county board chairman currently reports to the county board?
That is correct.
So if you have this the county administrator and the department heads then report through the county chairman to the county board, is that correct?
Well, in the pyramid, you have, in the form of government in Winnebago County, is that the county board is the head of county government in Winnebago County. The county board created the position of county board chairman, I believe in 1992. So then all of the authority from the chairman stems from the authority that is given to the chairman by the county board.
So I think my point here, and thank you Attorney Hyros, is that the changes that are being asked to be made, we already have this authority. The administrator already reports to this board. And honestly, whether she reports to us through the chairman or she reports to us directly, it's up to this board and up to our standing committees to set the policies that we want this administration and the chairman's office to enact. If we are unhappy with the flow of simply because we as a board have not set the guidelines that we expect the chairman's office and the administration to stand by. So at this point, making a change to the ordinance without a plan for operation, how one person is going to report to 20 versus reporting to 1, and actually having a process for putting that into place is not only premature, but it puts us with a giant unknown. We have a lot of things going on right now, from a potential deficit in the host fee fund due to this $3 million accounting error, to $6 million owed to potentially to the election authority, to additional items including public safety items at the sheriff coming down the pipeline. And we're going to go ahead and change our organizational structure just because some people have a problem with the person currently holding the chairman's seat. This is ridiculous. We, as a county board, have the authority to do what we want. If you don't want something to come before committee, it's the standing committee chairman that set that agenda. If they want something to come before the committee, they can bring information, they can request it from the administrator, they can request it from the chairman, and if they don't get it, things don't move. It's up to us. If we're going to, it's up to us to get things done. Changing this today doesn't fix any of that. And I think that we should reject this out of hand.
Thank you, Mr. Fellers. I believe Mr. Gurl was next, and then Mrs. Crosby. Mr. Gurl.
Thank you, Chairman. I guess my question is to Chairman Fiducia. maybe you can point out in these changes where exactly, Chairman, because what I've read, no power is being stripped away from the chairman. We are not addressing the section of the chairman as far as duties or anything else. This pertains to the administrator. Is that not correct?
You're correct. Basically, I believe the whole board had the handout where the changes were made, but the things that I see is going to be section 2-124 as far as the duties. In item A, where it says the county administrator shall be subject to the discretion of the county board and shall be supervised the administration of the following. And what that basically is the direction and control of the county board. Basically what that's doing is what she's always been able to do, but we're just clarifying that. We're just making that point. We're making that point, and that's the only glaring change I see.
So, just a quick follow-up. Thank you very much, Chairman. So, Mr. Fiducia, this would basically not take away any powers from the chairman. It would basically just redirect or basically give the board the better ability to have information as it comes into the county. Would that be correct?
I would say you're going to be 100% correct on that. I don't believe that's what this ordinance is intending to do. People are misinterpreting it that, but it's not.
Right, and there's been miscommunication out there that this is a power grab, which it is not. This board is simply just trying to do its judicial and legal role, as it is stated in the County Code of Ordinances, to enact legislations, to come up with policies, ordinances, procedures. That is our role, and I think the information is what's key. We're not changing or taking away the chairman's duties or anything like that. It would stay the same. Nobody would ever notice any real difference. All we're basically doing is just changing how the administrator reports to whom and how that is. The 20 bosses is a false statement. She would not have 20 bosses. Nothing would really change, basically, except for the control and the power. When a reporter calls and asks me about the City of Rockford Elections Department, I don't know anything but what I've read in the paper because nobody has told me, and I believe that's a problem. The transparency is what I'm looking for, so thank you.
Just to follow up to Mr. Gurl, just so we don't have an open loop left on the floor, we did discuss back a few months ago in the initial discussion around the election, $6 million legacy issue that came up when that initial letter came from our partners at the City of Rockford Board of Elections. That was discussed on the board floor. The updates have not been frequent because there hasn't been a lot of updates, meaning it has been under review since that time. There is no information, whether we change an ordinance or we don't change an ordinance. The information is as presented. There has not been a stifling, a filtering of that information coming up to the board because there has not been new information. That is part, in my opinion, with all due respect, part of the misinformation that is out there is that somehow things that are in one place will get to another place faster. And I guess my question for Mr. Fiducia is, you said essentially nothing will change, but information will improve. Can you explain the dichotomy of how are you as a committee chairman going to have more information tomorrow? Because I keep asking, with all due respect, I've asked legal, I've asked the board members, Mr. Fiducia, I've reached out to you through email and calls multiple times, and you have not been willing to engage me to get answered the few questions I've had. I generally just want to understand, what will you as a committee chairman be able to have you don't today? Because I heard two things. Things won't change, but then they will change. And so I'm just confused.
Okay, me personally, nothing is basically going to change as far as information. But if it comes time that I need to glean information, what I can do is I know I can go get that information unobstructed with a nonpartisan view, and that's what I think what the whole board is looking for. And I'm going to have to clarify something on this ordinance too. That if you look at this ordinance, it just wasn't Dave Fiducia that put this out, and there's been a lot of thought There's been a lot of thought that's gone into this. And by no way would there be anything that would change, but the only thing that we're saying is information. You're going to get that information unbiased, nonpartisan, and without fear of repercussion from anybody. And that's what I want. I want transparency in this government. And that's basically what this is just going to do. It's going to open some of the transparency issues that I feel we've had, or the board members felt they've had.
Can you name one thing, Mr. Fiducia, that you have asked for, that you have not received? Because last year you were the public safety chairman. I am not aware of one thing you asked for from our office, ever, as a chairman, or in your short time as policy and personnel chairman. I would like to understand what you haven't received. Mr. Salgado.
This is becoming a little bit personal here. Like, let's stick to the facts. Let's stick to the issues at hand, the ordinance at hand. I'm not going to question you or any of the county board members, what they've done, what they haven't done, what they did right or wrong at this point in time. I don't think that's uncalled for. That's why I'm calling a point of order on this.
Thank you, Mr. Salgado. I'm just trying to understand what we're changing from and to, and so with all due respect, I'll move on out of respect for your point. I don't understand what problem we're solving, to be very clear. Before I go back to Mr. Fellers a second time, there was a few other hands up. Mrs. Crosby. Mrs. Crosby.
Chairman Fiducia, when it comes to economic development and interfacing with developers and individuals that would invest in our community, who will be interfacing on behalf of the county and interfacing with people that are thinking, CEOs, CFOs, COOs, who are thinking on perhaps rooting their business here?
I would say that it would be the chair of the Economic Development Committee and the information, not through just one person, but they can go directly if need be.
I guess I need a follow-up on that. So the chairman of economic development will court these individuals that are thinking on coming to the community, correct?
If he wants to, I guess. I don't, you know, that's...
I'm asking a question for clarification.
As far as courting him goes, I don't understand what you're saying by courting, but what I am saying is that Mr. Westcott would have the authority, or should know anything that the chairman knows immediately, and not that information should right now. I'm just...
There was a newspaper article that came out today that said that there were private emails going back and forth regarding this ordinance and changes in drafting language, which is a smack in the face of nonpartisanship and transparency. So can you comment on that?
Sure. It was in June. It was in June because I wasn't aware of what we had as far as the county structure, and I asked a very knowledgeable former board member if he could assist me and explain this to me, and he did such. And basically, it was on my own private email, as I will investigate anything on my own private email.
Thank you, Mrs. Crosby. I believe I'm going to give it to others a first time before I go a second. And I think I had Mr. Kelly, then Mr. Hoffman, and if I'm out of that sequence, I apologize. Mr. Kelly.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. County administrator to the board and sent it to the county board chairman. If that's the case,
reporting, okay, yes, that's providing information, but it's also a supervision, establishing a supervision structure. Someone reports to someone who is their boss. Now, if we're taking the county board, and the 20 members of the county board are the boss of the administrator, that's problematic. And that's what the proposed change to the ordinance is doing.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. I would just comment, and then I'll go to Mr. Hoffman. My understanding is every county in the 102 counties in the state have a county board chairman, whether elected from within their board or not. Many of the larger counties have a chairman elected countywide. In every case, on a practical day-to-day basis, the chairman is the day-to-day liaison between meetings, the day-to-day liaison for the administrator. I'm not aware of an example when you fact check it and talk to administrators and chairmen and county board members of what's actually happening. That does not mean here or anywhere else that the county administrator, the department heads do not have direct, regular access between meetings and in meetings to provide unfettered professional advice to our county board, and that is an absolute fact. Thank you, Mr. Hoffman.
Thank you, Chairman. I feel like this got filibustered. I mean, I had a question in between two of you guys. You talked for like 10 minutes and left me out of this. I don't appreciate that.
Mr. Hoffman, you're up.
Okay, thank you. So, first thing I would like to say is to Mr. Kelly's the word of reporting. I don't know that reporting means that you don't always report just to your boss. That's the first thing. I think reporting means you're relating information back to a person. I don't necessarily mean it means you're reporting to your boss. Okay, that's the first thing. And second of all, we talked about whether the chairman would be involved in, I think, Ms. Crosby's question about if there was negotiations. I've not heard that. I think we're taking Dyer's instances and saying, hey, boy, the Titanic's going to sink. And nobody's saying that. I think we go back to what Mr. Girl said. I mean, the changes are slight. It's not about taking power from somebody. And Jaime, Mr. Salgado, made a point back at one of our meetings where saying that our county administrator is the one non-political entity involved with the county board. And I think that's a great thing. Everybody else has to answer to a political party. She doesn't. So I just want us to look at that and taking the negative side of everything. There might be some negative sides you guys come up with. I'm not saying there's not. But you can't pick apart individual words and use them to make up meanings that they don't necessarily mean. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hoffman. And I'm sorry, Mrs. Corl.
Thank you, Chairman. You know, I'm sitting here, I'm listening to all this. This whole thing has been blown so far out of proportion. It is ridiculous. We have been doing this as long as I've been on the board. This is something that we have continually done. And all of a sudden, they're saying that we're trying to take power away from the chairman, and all this whole thing is just blowing out. No one wants to take your power away. That's not the purpose of it. It's new economic development, and when you catch on something, you get a hold of the head of the economic development chairperson and discuss it with him, but that's between the two of you. We all know that many of these things with economic development cannot be brought out into the open or talked about because of the fact there's too much going on before we can even get anything going with economic development. That's a different story. In my situation, I sure would have, as a chairperson, would have liked to have known what was happening in advance before it was slapped to me at a meeting. At one of our committee meetings. This is something where the administrator could probably have softened the blow if I had known or had even been concerned about what I felt about the situation and what was going on. There's things that have gone on these last 2 years that have not been really, has not brought us together. It has separated us because we're all trying to protect our own territory. We do not have territory to protect. We are a group, a whole group that works together and not apart. I want to know as a chairperson what is happening on my committee, not my committee, but what's happening in the background that I should bring forward to my committee and discuss it with them to see if we can find a solution. Help things out, not create more problems, which we have. And I'm tired of all this nitpicking stuff. Chairman, you're still going to be chairman. Chairman, you're still going to have what you're supposed to be doing done. You will still do that. We have had a person, an administrator, who has taken us aside and said, are you aware of these things that are happening? And talk with us about it. If it can't be solved, we come to the chairman as a group and we discuss it with you. This is not what's happening right now. We're all becoming individuals, and that's got to stop. This whole thing, this whole nitpicking thing has got to stop. We aren't going to take any power away from you. We need to vote on this, get it over with, because we can talk it to death and still come up with the same solution.
Thank you,
Thank
you, Mrs. Gorel. Appreciate your comments. Just since you addressed me, I would like to respond very quickly. First of all, I have a great respect for you. I've asked those respectfully and repeatedly of the people, the committee leadership that's brought this forward. I have been avoided. I've been dodged. That's very disrespectful. That's not good communication, and I don't know how that helps us go forward tomorrow. All I'm looking for was the conversation on what this actually means. I've asked and asked, and with all due respect, what you just said, ma'am, was that you did talk to the county administrator, professional staff when there were questions on specific things. That is no different than any other council or board I'm aware of. And then there was an appropriate time to engage the chairman. So my point is, what I just heard was what we're saying we're going to do tomorrow, we're actually doing today and yesterday. To go back and forth with you, I respect you and I respect your position. I don't understand that. I also think, I thank you, I guess, for making my job easier. I think it actually makes it harder in certain areas. Nobody has answered this question for me, as I do not understand what moving me out of the org chart flow, which is essentially what this is, if I have the authority to direct employees, because my understanding, nobody has confirmed with me that is the case, direct and request information. Do I need to go get a resolution to do that? That is not, simple things have not been answered. Thank you, Mrs. Gorel. I know I had a hand up. Was there one in the back? No, Mr. McDonald. And again, I know I'm missing an order. We will get to you, Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is a good idea. I think the path that we're going down is worthy of going to. Some people feel that there's an element of being filtered, and we'd like to have a better direct line of communication with the administrator. I think these are worthy conversations that we should have. That being said, I have a real problem with this process. As Ms. Crosby pointed out, there's an article in the paper now that's talking about private servers and using up and just a bunch of backwoods BS. That's what the people of Winnebago County are tired of, is the backdoor deals. That's why I was supporting this, but in light of what had happened, I'm not going to support it, because it's more of the behind the scenes what's going on. And we need to be more transparent. We need to put it up in front. We need to have public meetings. You know, maybe I don't understand politics, and in some ways I'm proud that I don't understand politics. I don't want to understand it. I want to do what's right. And if we have to go around back channels to get things to happen, that tells me it's not right, it's not done with integrity. So I intend on voting no on this tonight, but would like to revisit it through Operations Committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. McDonald. I had, hold on, I want to go to everybody first time. Mr. Butita, then Mr. Webster. Mr. Butita.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm opposed to the amended ordinance that is before us this evening for multiple reasons. some others here, that this board can overcome the perception that we're a dysfunctional unit of government. I hope that we can become a board that can be proud and
that's what we do. Sometimes things can be in place for years and years and years, and things are fine. Other times, we change ordinances, quite often. So if someone could show me how these changes are a bad thing, because I don't see the negative on this at all. The board, as a legislative body, should have unfettered access to the administrator without any backlash, without it having to be filtered. The administrator is not an elected position. Doesn't have to kowtow to Democrats nor Republicans, either one. Which, by the way, this is a bipartisan thing here, whichever side of the issue you're on. It's bipartisan both ways here. I think that unfettered access should be codified, and that's exactly what this is. There's nothing in the changes that do any more than that. Think about that. There's nothing in there that does any more than that. It simply codifies things. And as for who's going to go out and talk to people for economic development, in the letter that I articulated to all of you, I wrote that county board chairman's time and efforts are would be more productively spent on legislative and economic development affairs in Winnebago County versus apolitical administrative affairs. And that's, as far as reporting in this business about having 20 bosses and all that, well, I guess technically you might say that, because if the administrator, by this code here, shall be subject to the direction and control of the county board. Well, administrator reports to the county board, obviously, at the same time as the chairman. The county board chairman. And in counties that operate with an administrator, that's the way it is. That's the way they do it. And like I said, I don't understand what the fear is in this. No one can tell me that there's anything more than codifying the administrator's job. That's all I have for now.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. I believe our We have a motion to call the question, and we have a second by Mr. Hoffman, which would end the discussion on this ordinance. It's not to approve, it is to end discussion. A yes vote would be to end discussion, which would allow us to vote at this time. A no vote would allow the discussion to continue. With that, I will ask the clerk to call the roll on calling the question. A yes vote ends discussion. A no vote continues the discussion.
To end the discussion, Goro,
Yes.
Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors,
Yes.
Mrs. Red,
Yes.
Mr. Salgado,
Yes.
Mr. Schultz, Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. West. Mr. Boomer, Mr. Booker,
No.
Mr. Butita,
No.
Mrs. Crosby,
No.
Fiducia,
Yes.
Mr. Gurl,
Yes.
Mrs. Goro,
Yes.
and then Mrs. Red.
Yes.
Mrs. Red is a yes.
Motion passes. 12-8. Motion passes 12-8. Thank you very much for the discussion. Next item of business.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next item is an agreement for nursing staff at River Bluff Nursing Home, and I so move.
We have a motion on the resolution authorizing the chairman of the county board to execute a staffing service agreement at River Bluff Nursing Home. May I have a second? Second by Mr. Boomer. Item is now before the board. Any discussion? Yes, Mr. Gurl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question. I noticed that I was going back in some reports, and I think it was noted in that some of the problems that we're experiencing out at River Bluff as far as lost revenues has to do with staffing and the number of staffing agencies that we use. And I was just wondering if we can have some clarification if that is still one of the leading things that is reducing revenues out there.
Colin?
Thank you, Chairman. It does increase our costs. However, we're having difficulties retaining CNAs, and when we sign up with these staffing agencies, we're just having them available in case we're short on shifts. It's not that we have to use them, it's that they're available if needed.
Thank you. Thank you, Carla. Thank you, Mr. Gurl. Any other questions by board members? Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How much more expensive are these staff people than are people that are on?
I believe CNAs are roughly health insurance coverage, and then IMRF and FICA. The staffing agency, I believe this one is $22 for each hour, but there would be no benefits then.
Approximately how much are the benefits added into their hourly wage?
I believe when we looked at an average, it's about 30% of the wage.
Thank you, Carla. Thank you, Mr. Arena. Any other questions on the item before the board? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much. Next item of business, Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next item for business is the resolution for the Winnebago County Animal Services to purchase new kennels. I'd like to speak to this.
Got a motion by Mr. Fiducia on the resolution awarding contracts for kennel renovations, a second by Mr. Boomer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want the board to understand that I think Mr. Frazier's pointed out very, very good that the kennels out at the Animal Service are outdated. Which you'll be voting on for a budget amendment came from a private fund which is supposed to help education and capital. So this is going to be a zero spend for the county. It's a win-win, and I got to give Mr. Frazier kudos.
Thank you, Mr. Fiducia. Mr. Boomer.
Clarification, it went through finance. Does it have to be okayed through finance before it goes through?
I do not believe we're allocating dollars, Carla.
What went through finance was the budget amendment to allocate the dollars, and then this is the approval of the contract.
Thank you very much. Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and that concludes my report.
Thank you very much. Next item of business is the Economic Development Committee. Mr. Westcott.
Thank you, Chairman. Before you, we have a resolution authorizing the county board chairman to enter into a intergovernmental agreement establishing the Northern Illinois Land Bank Authority, and I so move.
We got a motion by Mr. Westcott on the resolution regarding the land establishment of the land bank. I got a second by Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Neighbors, Mr. Fellers, Mrs. Red, and Mr. Gorel, and I believe Mr. Billick as well. Item is now before the board. Any questions by board members? Yes, Mr.
I spent some time looking into this issue. I think there's been some incorrect perceptions in the media and by the public of what a land bank is, and so I just wanted to talk about that first and some other points to keep in mind on this. A land bank does not have powers beyond what the county currently possesses. The powers of a land bank are only those that are transferred by the member units of government. A land bank will not expedite blight issues. We discussed this in committee. Both parties, a land bank and the county acting the same, would achieve the same result in terms of time. As the name suggests, a land bank is used to hold property. It allows the county to protect itself from liability when the deal goes bad. I'm not opposed. Land bank that they control themselves. The governance structure of the Peoria Land Bank is preferable to the one we are considering. Its executive director is directly accountable to the county board, and that land bank's board of directors is larger and from professions focused on property development. Also, the use of that land bank would that be the discretion of the county board, whereas the land bank we're considering tonight, our use of it is going to be subject to the discretion of the board that's established, the land bank board. We don't have complete control, or as much control. I think we should investigate the possibility for Winnebago County to be included in that legislation so we take advantage of the governance defined in the Peoria model. Waiting causes no harm. The Northern Illinois Land Bank has been formed. We are not preventing the other parties from using the land bank. The IGA we are considering allows members to join at a later date. If we cannot adopt the Peoria model, then we can reconsider joining the Northern Illinois Land Bank. I move that this proposal be tabled until we have taken the actions that I presented to you tonight.
So we have a motion by Mr. Arena to table the land bank discussion. A second by Mr. McDonald. The item is now before, excuse me, I'm sorry, Mr. Arena, point of order.
Mr. Webster corrected me. He said it should be laid over and not tabled.
You're pulling that back, and your motion that you're correcting is a motion to lay over the land bank, and then I'm looking for a second to lay over the land bank discussion. I have a second by Mr. McDonald, a second by Mrs. Gorel to lay that item over, and I'll throw in Mr. Webster as well. Thank you. Item is now before the board. The motion and the second is to lay over the land bank discussion. Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't disagree. I would disagree with the motion to lay this over, and here's why. The land bank has already been formed. Their trustees will meet at some point in the near future and begin to establish policy. If this board, if this county wants to be a part of the land bank, we want to be part of that policy and bylaw creation discussion. We won't get that if they start to create those while we're sitting this out and waiting. Likewise, we've been through this now with 2 committee meetings and fairly discussed. Creation of it and the powers that come to other people. We may still want to come into this down the road, but there's no harm in it for us to coming in right now. It costs the county nothing. It's all coming from a government grant. It's going to be run out of the RPC, which is a condition of the grant. You know, one thing to keep in mind here that this grant, we only get this grant for this if it is run by the Regional Planning Council. If it's run by anyone else, we don't get a grant. If the county wanted to start their own land bank as per Peoria, we'd have to put our own money in. Now, there's been some questions about how overly broad this IGA is. And I think, you know, one of the things to keep in mind that if you look at the South Suburban Land Bank, when it was initially formed, it formed with about 10 members. Within 5 years, it had close to 30. Now, you can't negotiate an individual IGA with 30 governmental agreements, nothing with 30 governmental entities. Nothing would essentially get done. It is the bylaws and the policies that the trustees create that establish how it operates. Now, I think Rockford, who passed this last week, had a really good idea. They had some concerns about the use of eminent domain by the land bank, and so, with their approval of the IGA, they passed a trailing resolution dictating certain policies and bylaws that they wanted as part of the land bank's creation. I think it would be a good idea for this committee, or for this board and the Economic Development Committee, to go and review the concerns we do have.
Point of order.
Yes, Mr. Girl.
Thank you. Is this discussion not about being laid over, or is this a discussion on the land bank? Because there was a motion to be laid over.
It's not debatable. That's a very good point. Okay. So thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Girl. The item before the board is to lay over the land bank discussion. That's the item before the board at this time. Any discussions on the layover, to lay over or not to lay over? Yes, Mr. Webster.
I see no harm in laying this over, getting some more information. I appreciate the due diligence that Mr. Arena. They have done more research on this than any 3 of us put together. So if there's more information out there, that's my reason for asking for the layover.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. Mr. Billick.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate appreciate that statement, Mr. Webster, and like Paul, he actually put in quite a lot of work. Actually, I would say he definitely put in more work than me. And as pertaining to this layover, I'm going to agree with a lot of everything that Paul said, but I'm going to disagree on the layover portion of it. And the only reason why I say that is similar to what Mr. Feller said, is we have a very limited window here, a limited amount of time, but we have a lot of exit strategies from it. I just disagree in that kind of circumstance. However, I do agree with the statement that Mr. Arena made about moving forward and trying to do something on our own.
Thank you very much, Mr. Billick. Any other comments?
I'm going to disagree with the layover because we need to join with the group now. So we're in on the policy makings, our trustees are there. If we wait, we won't have that chance.
Thank you, Mrs. Wright. Perhaps it's a question for Mr. Westcott, perhaps it's a question for Mr. Dunn regarding if we, just so we get the timing piece to Mrs. Red's point, if we lay this over, what is happening in the next couple of weeks, just so we're clear on a decision to lay over and the consequences of laying over, not laying over. Could someone speak to that? Mr. Dunn?
Winnebago County is welcome to join the Land Bank Society IGA at any time they see fit.
Excuse me, Mr. Dunn. I want to be very clear. Second, I want to make sure I understand that we're not missing a policy development window. If we're clear on that, then if you're saying we can't ask the question,
The motion is not debatable. It's a motion to lay over.
Okay.
That motion is not debatable.
the motion on the floor is to lay over, so we cannot ask a question of the impact of the layover on the formation of the land bank. Thank you very much, Mr. Kurlikas. So, Mr. Dunn, I'm going to withdraw my question. Your explanation of the impact of not joining the land bank, if we do not join the land bank now, we're withdrawing that. So thank you very much, Mr. Dunn. Are there any other questions on the layover before the board? To not lay over, and then we would make the second vote. I will ask the clerk to call the roll, please.
Mr. Kelly.
No.
Mr. McDonald.
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors.
No.
Mrs. Red.
No.
Mr. Tassoni.
Yes.
Mr. Webster.
Yes.
Mr. Westcott.
No.
Mr. Arena.
Yes.
Mr. Billich.
No.
Mr. Boomer.
Yes.
Mr. Booker.
Yes.
Mr. Butita.
No.
Mrs. Crosby.
No.
Mr. Fellers.
No.
Mr. Fiducia.
Yes.
Mr. Gurl.
No.
Mrs. Gorel.
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman.
No.
I get to break this one?
Still got the power, Phil.
Absolutely.
Unless Mr. Fellers goes home.
No, I do not want to lay over this item. I'd like to see us take action this evening. So the item is before the board, Mr. Schultz. Mr. Schultz.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Schultz.
I'm a slave to the red light.
How are we all?
So, thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the things I'm struggling with is, unless I've gotten poor information, the vast majority of the properties that are considered blighted are in the city of Rockford. And if we look at the unincorporated areas of Winnebago County, which is what we have authority over, and what we would be concerned about, is the city has all the authority they need, not only themselves individually to deal with their blighted property, but they also now are part of this land bank, which provides them with an additional tool to deal with their blighted property. That's where the primary problem lies. And maybe I'm missing something, but it seems like my Rockford core counterparts are really excited about this land bank idea, which you should be, because it gives the city, which has all these blighted properties, additional opportunity to deal with that blight. But by believing that it's a good thing, it doesn't mean it's a good thing for Winnebago County, which has a very small amount of blighted properties in the unincorporated areas relative to the city of Rockford. So I don't think that you're missing out as residents of the city of Rockford by not being part of this. I will also say that I agree with if a decision is made by the majority of the board members, which
whether in Winnebago County, whether in the city of Rockford, whether in Boone County, or anyone else that ends up joining this land bank. It gives the whole region a lot of options on how to deal with unproductive properties, right? Whether they're in the city of Rockford, the city of Belvedere, the county of Winnebago, Boone County, Freeport, etc. And I think this county, as the largest governmental body in the region, wants a voice, right? And that's what joining the land bank today does. It gives us a voice to sit at the table for setting policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fellers. Mrs. Rudd.
Thank you, Chairman. About a year ago in our strategic planning meeting, we talked about the west side needing forgets about the west side. District 18, we have a lot of blighted properties. So I'm hoping that this land bank can help this district out.
Mrs. Rudd, a follow-up, because your district also includes portions of unincorporated Winnebago County, is that correct?
Yes, it does.
So although the primary is Rockford, there's also pieces that have blight. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Mrs. Rudd. Mr. Salgado.
Yes, I would like to call Mr. Dunn. This question that you were prevented from asking, timeline, is there a restriction? What does this mean if it doesn't get passed? Will you guys continue to progress with Boone County and some of the other areas that you guys have done? What's the intent here? I know that there's a grant out there. What's the dollar amount that you guys are seeking? Will this help you with Winnebago County if they come on board? So those are the two questions that I want answered, and hopefully Mr. Mike Dunn Jr. can answer those questions.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Salgado. Mr. Dunn.
Can you step up to the microphone there,
Thank you for the question, and again, thank you for considering our
filed roughly a year and a half ago to IDA, State of Illinois, a grant on behalf of Winnebago, Boone, Rockford, and Belvedere with their permission to seek out funding for the creation of a land bank. It was a grant that was submitted in a competitive process throughout the state. The state of Illinois had so many competitive grants that they deemed worthwhile that everybody saw reduced funding in what was asked for. There was not enough money to go around. With that said, our reduced award from the state of Illinois was $225,000. That was $150,000 for the acquisition of property, with $75,000 towards legal costs and other startup costs to get the land bank going. IDA expects us to apply for additional IDA money as far as whether Winnebago, so the baseline is Winnebago did go after that money in a coalition grant with Boone, Belvedere, and Rockford, and IDA is paying attention. The good news is that we received the second biggest award in that grant process because we brought the region together, representing the 2 counties and 2 of the larger cities. The city of Freeport, since they were home rule like Peoria, they have home rule. The city of Freeport also received an IDA grant for $10,000, and because of the size of the award, they have approached IDA, and IDA agrees with them that they would also join the Northern Illinois Land Bank. So Freeport would be joining and signing this IGA at a later date. I can't speak towards what could happen based on timing of who signs the IGA when. I was informed by Mayor Jury that they plan to approve the IGA on Monday, and I know Mayor Rail, Poplar Grove, and Mayor Rail, South Beloit, Poplar Grove, and I believe Cherry Valley are all considering signing the IGA as well. Mayor McNamara shared with me this afternoon and told me I could speak on his behalf that both him and the city of Belvedere plan on appointing a trustee extremely fast and asking the board to sit very soon. They no longer want to wait. We prevented South Beloit and other areas from signing the IGA until the 4 people that were responsible, 4 entities that were responsible for the grant, Boone, Winnebago, Rockford, Belvedere, had a chance to vote on the IGA. Loves Park on Monday now wants to do it.
Mr. Dunn, just to follow up, how many folks participate in the South Suburban Land Bank again?
31 municipalities. And then Cook County, being a home rule county, and it's because they're a home rule county, also has their own separate land bank.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Dunn, for all the work you've done on this. I appreciate what you've done, and I think my opposition is more about just the philosophy that's in place here. I just want you to clarify for the board the method to withdraw. It's only at the expiration of the term with a 60-day, the annual term with a 60-day notice prior, not 60 days anytime, right?
Sure, and I think speaking to the partners, they're going to clarify that language in a board policy that says it truly is 60 days. And they're
60 days at any time.
So there's going to be a clarification policy in the IGA that with 60 days notice you may remove. And even if that clarification language is not there, the legal opinion that we've been offered is you say you're leaving, right? You give 60 days notice. At that time, you're not incurring any future charge. And you still have that veto power to make sure that within your jurisdiction, no property can be acquired. So even if you have to wait till the end of the fiscal year, which we believe we can clarify, in that period that you give notice to the end of the fiscal year, pretty much nothing can really happen without your approval.
All right, well, that's very good to hear. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arena. I have a couple hands up. I think I saw Mr. Webster first. Mr. Webster.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I want to be clear about this. I'm not opposed to the concept of land bank. I'm not at all opposed to that. I'm not anywhere near as wise about it as certainly not as Mr. Dunn, and most certainly not as much as Mr. Arena. I think that concept has been around since the 40s, if I recollect, World War II era. Anyways, the thing that I was just concerned with there was when Mr. Fellers made a statement there that this doesn't cost us anything. But as from statements from Mr. Arena, it doesn't cost us anything not to do it right now either. And so I think that based on the litany of reasons and the research, the reasons that Mr. Arena came up with, that's the reason of supporting the layover on this. I'm not trying to kill it. That's why I corrected him about tabling it. Tabling it, that would kill it effectively. You know, it'd have to be drug out of committee, and no one would want to do that. But at any rate, once again, that's the reason for a layover, and as you see, half of us thought that it was worthy of a layover to look into the things that Mr. Arena has brought up, and I didn't think that would hurt a thing. I'm with Dorothy 100% on cleaning up the blighted properties in her district. With Angie, the same way. With our health department director, Sandra, I talked to Sandra the same way. I'm 100% behind that. But I'd like to see us just get it right, and I didn't think, because it's been stated as well, that we can jump in at any time, I didn't think there'd be a reason not to, you know, kick this around the block one more time before we finalize the deal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Webster. Mr. Salgado.
Yes, I just want to thank you, Mr. Dunn, for all your work you guys done out at Regional Plan. There's a couple things here. Mr. Paul Arena has brought good observations, good points, same with Mr. Village, on that we could do it ourselves at this point in time. However, we did apply for a grant, and we were part of it, so we're already in this. That's one piece of it. I think structurally right now, the way it's being structured, it makes sense to go with regional plan and develop this land bank to continue to speed the process up, clean it up, and obviously put property back on tax rolls. So on that aspect, but I do agree with Mr. Paul Arena on this, that potentially we could do it ourselves. However, we don't have the bandwidth. I believe that the regional plan has been focused on these things and these issues. So I strongly urge our colleagues to kind of move that direction. But I think it's good topic discussions to talk about these things and how, you know, if we ourselves, the county, could do something like this. But at this point in time, I think we're in the middle of losing out on an opportunity potentially here, since there's more bandwidth, more personnel, more resources allocated out there for whether it's the, you know, the clean title, the process, the legal process, and obtaining. If we were in the meeting, and one of the questions was, I believe, you know, what about the cost? Well, as more counties, more cities, more municipalities jump on, the cost of matching grants decreases significantly. So that's a plus on that end that Mr. Dunn kind of addressed at the committee meeting level. So I think it just makes sense at this point in time to continue to do that and move forward. So I strongly agree with Mr. Village and Mr. Arena that it is, I have some issue as well myself, having the regional plan kind of dictating the role and situation of how the operations are going to go about. And obviously, you know, what it entails, the future, obviously, of, you know, who's going to get, what properties are going to be looked at and which ones are going to be processed through the system. Obviously, there is a trustee board that will do that, determine that. But at the end, as we know, the city of Rockford, you know, is a large city that has a lot of light property. What about the other players out there? So just, those are concerns that are out there, but I just want to make sure that I think this is the opportunity for us to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Salgado. Mr. Dunn, on a follow-up, because I think there's a point to that, and then I know there's a couple hands up, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you, and I'll try to be brief. I was told by my better, Mr. Setter, who would be the day-to-day operator of the land bank, as I left your committee, that I failed to mention something that I'd like to mention to all of you now. And that is, in a previous meeting, Mayor Rail, who I believe has been a leader on this in South Beloit, observed a really interesting thing in his support for the land bank. And that is, he said, far too often in the county, and I'm paraphrasing him, but far too often in the county, cities are pitted against cities when it comes to economic development projects, and that there's competition within Winnebago County over who gets what. And he said the reason and the novel concept of a land bank, and the reason why he's supportive of it, and it was to your question, I believe, on how many houses does the city get versus how many buildings does Belvedere get. Mayor Rail approached it differently. He said that this is the one thing that we can all join, we can all be a part of, and we're absolutely actually rooting for the other city. Because we know we want that project in that other city to be a success, so the money comes back to the land bank, and that might be money that now we get in our community. So Mayor Rail showed a lot of wisdom in saying that this isn't competition between cities that are in the land bank. It's not fighting over scarce resources. Rather, it is, if McChesney gets this project, we're all rooting for the project to be successful for McChesney because we want to use the return on that investment for our own community.
Thank you, Mr. Dunn. I'm sorry if I'm missing a hand that was up. Mr. Girl.
Thank you, Chairman. I've heard a few times that this is not going to cost us anything, but if I'm not mistaken, was it not a deal that there was a $100,000 commitment the first year, $100,000 commitment the second year from the host fees for this? Am I mistaken on that?
I don't. Carla?
I think that's the John Phelps.
I was. I got them confused with the John Phelps. Thank you.
Thank you for clarifying that, and that's a very good question, just so we're clear on the floor. Mr. Girl, Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dunn, I think I was sat in the meeting there and got a lot of information. All the information I have primarily came from the committee meeting in there. But just could you help me understand basically what would be the board makeup, trustee makeup, where they're from, how many, so to speak, and just help me understand how you acquire the property. Say, oh, we're gonna take this property and we're gonna do this with it, demo it, rehab it, sell it, or whatever it is, and maybe at some point the county said, no, that's one we want for demolition, or what the case. How would we coordinate which properties you're actually going to rehab or demo or what it might be?
Sure, Mr. Tassoni, thank you, I appreciate it. First, the land bank, any signatory to the IGA, whether you are a municipality or a county, gets one appointment to that land bank board, and the land bank board makes decisions for the most part on a majority basis. So you could be South Beloit and your vote would be equal to the city of Rockford. A county appointee has the same voting power as a municipality trustee. Second, the Regional Planning Council is governed by an executive committee at the end of the day of 6 members, Winnebago County being one of them. So Winnebago's oversight on this operation is both as appointing an independent trustee with no conflict to an independent board that should not be completely tied to the operations of a county or a city. But their oversight also extends to their governance over the Regional Planning Council, in which they are a capital partner. Second, as far as, I'm sorry, the second part of your question was the ability to acquire property. In that regard, we've put many safety measures in the IGA so that the land bank board or the land bank operation never infringes on the sovereignty of one jurisdiction or ever basically encroaches on a county board or a city council's right to make decisions. In that IGA, the land bank cannot acquire a property in that jurisdiction without going back to the jurisdiction, and we refer to it as a veto in the IGA. The county board or city council or whatever mechanism that jurisdiction relies on has to say we agree with the land bank board's decision to acquire this property in our jurisdiction. Second, a property cannot just be given to the land bank. A county chairman or a mayor cannot say you must acquire this property. The land bank board must also agree to it. So a city cannot just keep sending properties to the land bank, or a county through the trustee program cannot send properties just to a land bank, where the other members feel that it is an undue burden. The land bank board has a safety check on that as well.
Thank you, Mr. Dunn. A follow-up, Mr. Tassoni.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just help me, when we're looking down the road, whenever that may be, would maybe 6 properties were identified, the land bank would ask for this board's permission or special council committee, or how would you be approved to, okay, go on with those 6?
So if a land bank board authorizes the acquisition of 6 properties through whatever means, wherever each of those properties are located, say you have 3 properties in Belvedere, Belvedere City Council and the Belvedere Mayor would be approached to give us an up or down on each one of those properties. Likewise, if we are asked to acquire a property in unincorporated Winnebago or in a city, municipality in Winnebago that doesn't otherwise sit on the land bank board, we would be coming to Winnebago County and asking.
Thank you, Mr. Dunn. Any other follow-ups, Mr. Tassoni? Mr. Billick?
Just want to quickly say, as far as this land bank goes, thank you everybody who actually put in a lot of input on this. This is actually a huge deal, and one of the reasons why I kind of looked into this is, like Mrs. Red said, was actually I grew up in a lot of the lower neighborhoods coming up, and one of the things was I wanted to make sure that everybody was protected. And my only concern, and I agree with everything that Paul Arena said, if we wanted to start our own thing, we can definitely do that. My only reason why I said no to the layover, and again, just to reiterate, is that we can move forward with this and be able to still be on that board to actually make those decisions that we need to make based on how we feel that our constituents, what best represents our voters and constituents as well in the entire county, not just in one city or another.
Thank you, Mr. Billick. Any other questions, comments by board members? Mrs. Gorel.
Thank you, Chairman. This does also include commercial and industrial buildings too.
Yes.
I think that's important. We just keep thinking it's houses, and we need to understand that this concerns a whole lot more because we have a lot of vacant buildings all through Winnebago County that are useless anymore. The other thing is, are these going to be available so that investors and non-for-profits can also purchase through that land bank? Is that going to be open to them?
So I cannot speak today to what the board, the trustees will determine as disposal strategies for the properties. Often, and I've suggested it in explaining the concept to many people, Mr. Gurl brought up the John Phelps initiative, and I brought it up earlier in committee today. Often those groups that are doing the good work in the neighborhood will use a land bank as a source of their next project. So a land bank theoretically could provide properties to large institutions, to nonprofits, to churches, back to government, or to hopefully the private sector. If you take a property, the only home rule power being used by the land bank is that of disposing of the property. There is no home rule power being used to acquire a property. And the reason for that and that advantage of using home rule power to dispose of a property is you might want to give that home to somebody in the neighborhood in an intentional way that without home rule you cannot do. And in that intentional way you could say that you have 6 months to get a certificate of occupancy on that home, and if you don't, the property would revert back to the land bank. And the person who enters into that agreement would know full well that that's an expectation put on them. The beauty of that is the property doesn't just go back into the private sector's hands, but by the very nature of having to get that certificate of occupancy, you now have to go pull permits. And when you go pull permits, that triggers a assessor coming out to revalue the property. So when we talk about putting property back in the private sector's hands and hopefully seeing it grow EAV, the best way to see a home generate a larger EAV and lessen the tax burden for everyone is to have permits pulled.
Thank you, Mrs. Gorel. Thank you, Mr. Dunn. Mr. Gurl.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a quick question, and this has to pertain with the land bank and acquiring property. Let's just say a property, commercial, whatever it might be, but let's just say just for this, that the property out on West State in Springfield that was initially developed many, many years ago, then was left. I think a lot of us know what property it is, but would the land bank be able to come in and take over something that was started to be developed, but maybe the developer lost financing or went a different way and the property is in the midst of being developed? Could the land bank come in at that point after a certain amount of time and say, this is something that we would like to acquire and get it back to another developer to complete that?
So Mr. Grohl, in theory, yes, but again, as a reminder, the land bank has no special powers that a city or government would not have. So that in order to acquire the property, the question would be at what state of ownership is it in, and at what state of having a lien or liability on it. What is the status of that? So whether it's up for auction, whether it's headed to the county trustee, whether it's owned by a government, whether it's in private sector hands. If it's in private sector hands, and the taxes are being paid and it's not abandoned, there's nothing the land bank can do about it. The land bank cannot assess, cannot levy a property tax. It cannot charge the Winnebago County any member fee without the Winnebago County Board going along with it. It cannot charge any sort of impact fee or assessment on a property. So if it is in private sector hands and the private sector individual is complying with laws, there is nothing I or my staff or the land bank board can do about it, which is the right thing.
Follow up, Mr. Grohl.
Thank you very much. And I think that clears up a lot of the misperception that was out there that this land bank would just come in and take over your property if the city or the county or the municipality didn't like it, or if they thought it was vacant. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Dunn, just a question to put it on the record. Does the land bank have eminent domain powers?
No, even if the IGA stated as such, which it does not, it is silent. I truly wish we were overboard and just simply put it in the IGA. It's too late for that. But even if the IGA stated it, we would not be allowed to exercise eminent domain.
Thank you. Any other questions? I see a couple hands shot up. Mr. Schultz, then Mrs. Crosby, then Mr. Webster. Mr. Schultz.
Yeah, when I read the agreement, my understanding was that any decisions that are made by the board, that the parties that were involved in that, which would include us if we joined this, are held accountable for those decisions. So to the point that I made previously, Mr. Fellers, if a budget is passed and there's a decision about what the share is of Winnebago County, even if 60 days later we're out, we'll still owe what we committed in that budget decision, because anything that's agreed to prior to us not being part of it will have to be accountable for those decisions. That's what it says in the agreement.
Mr. Schultz, I think that this is a topic we want to get very clear on. So if it's okay, I'm going to have Mr. Dunn address that timing issue on what actually practically would happen.
So we're looking forward as staff to suggest certain board policies to the land bank board to clarify some of these concerns. But as our lawyer has shared with us in his interpretation of how the IGA reads, when the fiscal year has begun for the land bank, since 2 municipalities have entered into the agreement, the fiscal year does not reset until July 1st. Anything that would happen between now and July 1st, as far as the board approving a budget or enacting a membership fee, would not be active until the next fiscal year. Therefore, the earliest a membership fee could be assessed wouldn't be until July 1st. Thereafter, the next fiscal year, which would be fiscal year 2020, starting July 1, if the land bank board were to decide to start a membership fee, again, they would have to vote on setting that fee and then also vote on an approved 2021 budget. Plenty of notice for Winnebago County if they were in the minority and the county board said we won't appropriate that money. Plenty of time for the county to, if they find themselves in the minority of that vote and that decision, to leave the land bank with no money due. The only money that would be due to the land bank if Winnebago County were to leave would be if Winnebago County had approved to acquire a property under the transaction fee and agreed to subsidize the acquisition of a specific parcel with the land bank board, and obviously the land bank board would have to agree to that as well. So my long explanation basically says that any membership fee that would be enacted by a majority of the land bank board could not be assessed or a party be made liable to until the following fiscal year.
Thank you. Next, Mr. Schultz, did you have a follow-up, sir? Oh, thank you, Mr. Schultz. Mrs. Crosby, then Mr. Webster.
I would like to call the question.
We have a motion to call the question. May I have a second on the calling of the question? Mr. Kelly, Mr. Neighbors, and I believe Mrs. Gorel. The motion and the second is to call the question, which would end discussion. A yes vote would end discussion. A no vote would continue the discussion. With that, I will ask the clerk to call the roll on the calling of the question. Yes will end the discussion.
Okay, Mr. McDonald?
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors?
Yes.
Mrs. Red?
Yes.
Mr. Salgado?
Yes.
Mr. Schultz?
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni?
Yes.
Mr. Webster?
Yes.
Mr. Westcott?
Yes.
Mr. Arena?
Yes.
Mr. Village?
Yes.
Mr. Boomer? Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
Mr. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Fiducia,
Yes.
Mr. Gurl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gurl,
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly.
Yes.
20, call the question.
Okay, made that easy. So we will end discussion, and with that, I will ask the clerk to take the roll call on the vote. A yes would approve the land bank, a no would decline it. Clerk, come up.
Mr. Neighbors,
Yes.
Mrs. Red,
Yes.
Mr. Salgado, Mr. Schultz, Mr. Tassoni,
Yes.
Mr. Webster,
Yes.
Mr. Westcott,
Yes.
Mr. Arena,
No.
Mr. Billich,
Yes.
Mr. Boomer,
No.
Mr. Booker,
Yes.
Mr. Butita,
Yes.
Mrs. Crosby,
Yes.
Mr. Fellers,
Yes.
Mr. Fiducia,
Yes.
Mr. Gurl,
Yes.
Mrs. Gurl,
I want to pass right now.
Mr. Hoffman,
Yes.
Mr. Kelly,
Yes.
Mr. McDonald,
Yes.
Mrs. Gurl,
I want to say no.
4.
16 to 4, motion passes. We are joining the land bank. Thank you very much for a good discussion. Mr. Westcott.
Thank you, Chairman. That concludes my report.
Thank you very much, sir. Next item of Business Finance Committee, Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to make this brief than the other ones, so bear with me. The first one, we have a resolution authorizing settlement of a claim against the County of Winnebago entitled Patricia DeMario versus the Winnebago County in the amount of $15,394.99. I'd like to move for that.
You got a motion by Mr. Salgado on the resolution regarding the claim entitled Patricia DeMario versus Winnebago County. May I have a second, please? Second by Mr. Hoffman and a second by Mr. Gurl. Item is now before the board. Any questions or comments by board members? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much, Mr. Salgado.
Yes, the next item is, has been laid over, the budget amendment 2019-014 Veterans Assistance Funds to be laid over. At our committee meeting, we decided to lay this over to our further finance committee to have the representatives speak to that budget and get clarification on why they're asking for additional funding versus what their existing budget was in the prior years. We understand, I've spoken to the gentleman, which is in the back of the room, so we have a little bit more questions on that. We just want clarification. Nothing has to do with stalling or trying to avoid any of the decisions on the budget amendment. Just for clarification on that, I just wanted to address that, and hopefully in the next finance committee meeting, we'll be voting on that so we can have further discussions on that. So next item is the budget amendment 2019-015 Animal Service Donations Fund to be laid over. I'm going to move to suspend the rules so we can vote on it tonight.
So we have a motion by Mr. Salgado to suspend the rules on budget amendment 2019-015 Animal Service Donation Fund. I need a second. Mr. Westcott, Mr. Fiducia, and Mr. Gurl. We need 12 votes on that. Yes. So the item before the board is to suspend the rules, which would allow us to vote this evening in a separate vote. Yes vote to suspend the rules. All in favor of suspending the rules signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? Motion passes. We've suspended the rules. Thank you very much. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to move to approve Budget Amendment 2019-015 Animal Services Donation Fund to be voted on today.
We got a motion by Mr. Salgado, Budget Amendment 2019-015 Animal Service We have a second, Mr. Hoffman and Mr. Webster, thank you. Item is now before the county board. Any discussion on this item? Seeing none, since it's a budget amendment, we'll vote a little bit different. Are there any members who are opposed to this motion? Seeing none, we'll cast a yes vote for all members present. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Mr. Salgado.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just as a reminder, we will be having a joint Finance and Public Safety Committee meeting on February 6th. More to come. We'll send out an agenda on that, and hopefully the sheriff, Mr. Carter, is back in the room. Will present the quarterly reports. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Salgado. Next item of business, Zoning Committee, Mr. Webster.
I just got orders to hurry up. I just want to say one thing, though. I think we had some good discussion tonight, and that was a healthy discussion about the land bank. And I think that's more open dialogue than we've had on this board floor on any one topic in quite some time. So, anyways, Zoning Committee has 5 items on our agenda tonight, kind of a mixed bag here. The first 4 were in for a layover from our previous meeting. I'm going to take these one at a time because there's a little bit of an explanation here. Number 1 was SU 0518, and that came with approval from Zoning Board of Appeals 5-0, and Zoning Committee followed suit with a unanimous decision 7-0, and I move to approve.
We got a motion by Mr. Webster on SU 0518, special use permit. May I have a second? Mr. Westcott, Mr. Fellers, Mrs. Gorel. Item is now before the county board.
This being a special use permit, it comes with conditions. I need to note that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Webster. With conditions, any discussion by board members or comments? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much. Mr. Webster.
Okay, number 2 is Z1718, and that's a map amendment to rezone a parcel. And Zoning Committee is referring that case back to the Zoning Board of Appeals for their March 13th meeting for some clarification on some testimony regarding fire matters. Okay, so that's the motion, is to send this back to Zoning Board of Appeals, Z1718.
We got a motion by Mr. Webster to send Z1718 back to the ZBA. May I have a second on that? Mr. Fellers and Mrs. Gorel, a motion and a second to send this item 2, back to the ZBA. Any discussion by board members? All those in favor of sending this back to the ZBA signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. We'll send that back to the ZBA. Mr. Webster.
Okay, number 3 is Z1818, and that one unanimous approval from both Zoning Board of Appeals and Zoning Committee, so I would move to approve.
We got a motion by Mr. Webster on Z1818, a map amendment. May I have a second, please? Mr. Kelly and Mr. Hoffman and Mrs. Gorel. The item is now before the board, Z1818. Any discussion by board members? Yes, Mrs. Red.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm thinking, I might be wrong, maybe 5-6 years ago, I think this was rezoned. So why are we doing it again?
Because it was not used for a year. And so at that time, I believe they were operating under a special use. And so when you're not operating that for a year, then that permit disappears. It has to be actively operated. And so it wasn't operating for a year, apparently. And so Detroit and staff determined that they had to come in and have this zoning map change.
Mrs. Red, on a follow-up, you good? Thank you very much, Mrs. Red. Any other discussion by board members on Z1818, item 3 on your agenda? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes. Mr. Webster.
Thank you. Number 4 is Z 2018. Now that came with unanimous approval from the Zoning Board of Appeals, but we had a split decision on zoning committee, but we did approve that as well. So I would move to approve.
We got a motion by Mr. Webster on Z 2018. May I have a second, please? Mr. Hoffman again, Mr. Billick, and Mrs. Gorel. Item is now before the board. Any discussion by board members? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? We're going to note Mr. Schultz on the no vote, all other, and Mr. Neighbors on the no vote. All other members will cast a yes vote for it. Motion passes 18-2. Thank you very much. Mr. Webster.
Thank you. And last but not least, number 5 is in for a layover for the first reading. This is Z 0119.
Thank you very much.
And that's all your committee has for tonight.
Thank you very much, Mr. Webster. Next item of business, Operations Administrative Committee, Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Operations Committee has one resolution for you tonight. It's a resolution to pay for emergency services rendered for flood cleanup damage at the Public Safety Building.
We got a resolution by Mr. McDonald on a motion to pay for emergency services rendered for flood cleanup damage. May I have a second, Mr. Hoffman? Item is now before the county board. Any discussion by board members? Yes, Mr. Fiducia.
This is for the PSV after Justice Center? Correct. What flooded?
The basement during the big flood, June of 18, we had all that flood. Rockford Memorial Hospital flooded, and we got water in the basement.
We got water, was it like in the range, in the mortar? Where did it go?
I know evidence was, maybe Carl could speak to it better.
Ann?
Yes, I can speak to it. I guess the water was up quite high around the morgue, the whole lower level. And this company that was hired is the only one that could come out within 2 hours and do the work. Because everyone else was busy, so.
Thank you very, very much, Ann. Mr. Fiducia on a follow-up.
What would be the amount, and did we look to suppress that problem so we don't have it again? Because I just went through the building, which is scheduled for demolishment, and I was just wondering, you know, are we looking to abate that problem if it, you know, happens again?
We'll follow that up. Ann or Carla?
I believe they're in the process now of looking at that, and then there's some mold issues that they're addressing.
Thank you very much.
What's the price? What are we getting charged?
$34,385.
Thank you, Mr. Fiducia. And thank you, Carla. Any other discussion or questions by board members? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much.
Concludes the report.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Next item of business, Public Works Committee, Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Jim. We have no report.
Thank you, Mr. Tassoni. Next item of business, Public Safety Committee, Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have 3 resolutions. First resolution is authorizing contractor agreement to retain services to support the Winnebago County Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, CJCC. Unanimous approval through Public Safety Committee and strongly supported by the Chief Judge of 17th Judicial Circuit Court. And I move for its adoption.
We got a motion by Mr. Booker on the resolution authorizing contractor agreement to retain services to support the Winnebago County Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, CJCC. I have a second by Mr. Butita. Thank you. Item is now before the county board. Any questions or comments by board members? To be clear, this is a budgeted item. I'll come right to you, Mr. Salgado. Thank you. This is a budgeted item already approved in fiscal year 19. $50,000 was set aside out of the 1% for prevention rehabilitation. we're doing, just for transparency purposes, running this through the board, so you know that we're asking for 20 of the approved 50 to go to this initiative. I saw a hand up, Mr. Salgado, then Mr. Arena.
Yeah, you kind of answered my question there, and just going forward, how much it's going to cost us to fund this. And is it the regional planning council that is going to be managing this side? Who was, I kind of read a little bit, I wasn't too clear on it, and I couldn't stay at the public safety meeting, committee meeting, so I just would like a little bit of clarification. Who's running it, and how's it going to be managed, and the annual cost for us to support that. And I think it's a good thing that we continue to support these initiatives, but just want clarification on those things.
Sure. If it's okay, would you like to speak to it, or would you like
Sure.
me to?
The Region 1 Planning Council is providing administrative support. They bring forward, they help with ideas and planning, and they'll be involved in planning of recidivism prevention and such. So, and the other part of your question, as the chairman stated, $50,000 is already budgeted. This will cost $40,000 for 24 months.
To build on what Mr. Booker said, there was a grant that was applied for. They cut back their funding. They ask, and it's an ask, I believe. Our state's attorney, the chief judge, the public defender, myself all participate in this with some of our other partners. We would be asked for a total of 40 over 24 months, so 2020, and then the city of Rockford would pay 10 and 10 for a total of 20. There's a designated person that is paid for to focus on this activity through this grant, and this would help fund that activity. There's two things that the committee was asked to participate in, or invited the board to participate in. CJCC meetings is probably one of the more informational, high-level public safety meetings that I've been a part of, and although I'm not in that world, when the chief judge says he learns a lot at them, I think that really says something. The second are focused deterrence meetings, which probably the coolest thing I've seen as chairman are some of those call-in meetings, and the board will be invited at different times to both over the course of the year. Any other questions, comments, follow-ups? Just want to make sure I don't miss a hand. Follow-up, Mr. Salgado.
Sorry that I keep asking these questions, but they're real good for my sanity piece. So let me get this straight. I know, I want to say there's a university that did this study. Is that a relation to that? Now, I believe it came through Bruce Rauner's office that provided the funding for this feasibility study on the criminal justice system. Is that how this all got started? And then, but my question was, how did the regional, planning get essentially the administrative rights to operate and run this? I just want clarification on that, how it all developed. I don't know if it can be answered now or later. I just would like some clarification on that.
Sure, I may be able to go to somebody we know a little bit in Julia Halstead, but what I would say is the ICEJA grant that we applied for, some of the funding got cut back. The person that the Regional Planning Council, I believe, there's criminal justice coordinating councils all over the state, or there's multiple in the state. That's just the housing facility. If this grant would go away in 3 or 4 or 5 years, then we would deal with it there. But in the meantime, it's just funding this. We're filling a funding gap on getting a little bit less grant dollars than initially proposed by ICEJA. Is that correct, Julia?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Are we, Mr. Salgado, are you, we got you taken care of, okay. Any other discussion by board members? Okay, with that, the motion is for the ICEJA, or excuse me, the CJCC funding. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Motion passes unanimously, or excuse me, let me pull that back. Mrs. Gorel is the no vote. The other 19 are yes votes. Motion passes 19-1. Thank you very much, Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Second resolution is authorizing the execution of intergovernmental cooperation agreement with the forest preserves of Winnebago County for police services.
We got a motion by Mr. Booker on the forest preserve IGA. Any discussion, or excuse me, may I have a second on Mr. Booker's motion? I have a second by Mr. Fellers, Mrs. Gorel, Mrs.
read and Mr. Butita. Any discussion by board members on this IGA with the Forest Preserve for Police Services with our Sheriff's Department? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The third and final is resolution of the county board to agree to the health services agreement with the University of Illinois Chicago. I'd like to take this moment to thank Ms. Johns, Captain Owens of County Corrections, Mr. Vedra, Juvenile Court Services, and from the Sheriff's Department, Chief Carner, for their timeless efforts into this. Bids were laid out and such, but I move for its adoption.
We have a motion by Mr. Booker on the resolution awarding inmate health service care services. May I have a second, please? Mr. Girl, Mr. Butita, Mr. Webster, thank you. Item is now before the county board. I would just say Ann is very much encouraging passage of this because of some time constraints. Ann, do you want to give a quick 20-second on that, just so we're clear on the board floor? I know this was discussed at committee.
Thank you, Chairman. The university informed us last week that they need 60 days to ramp up or to ramp down, and if we don't give them a positive outcome by tomorrow morning, they're going to withdraw their offer because they need to start the layoff process immediately or the hiring process. And so we can't really afford to start over with our number 2 vendor because there's no way they can ramp up because everyone that we have under contract now, the contract expires March 31st. There's absolutely no more renewals. And the legal department at the university takes about a month to get through the signature process. So this is our drop dead deadline. Please take that into consideration.
Thank you, Ann. Any other discussion by board members? Any questions? Okay, if not, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? We're good. Okay, thank you very much. Motion passes unanimously. Mr. Booker.
Excuse me, Chairman. Mr. Webster.
Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Aaron. I've got a question for you. This past weekend, I was at a function, and a woman that was attending this function, I think she was with perhaps with the Reach Out Jail Ministry. Anyways, she was very concerned about the costs out of the commissary to people that are incarcerated in the jail. And she pointed out, I think she said one example was a little thing of shampoo. They were being charged $3 for, and it wasn't, it's like 50 cents worth of shampoo. And so her point was to us there is that these people are already in a bad position, in a bad place, and we shouldn't be taking advantage of them by making money off of them in the commissary. So is there any comment to that?
That issue has been brought up in discussion recently, and the discussion that I've been involved with, I've been assured by our corrections superintendent, Captain Owens and Chief Carner, that prices are comparable to what you would buy at any of the convenience stores. Correct me if I'm wrong, Chief, or Captain Owens?
Okay, thank you. Ann, go ahead, Ann.
Thank you, Chairman. By law, the prices cannot be higher than a convenience store pricing. So a bag of Doritos is no higher. And we literally did a cost comparison to everyone that bid, including current prices. This business is actually lower than our current prices for some of these same items, and they were the lowest of all the vendors. Even though the percent of commission was lower, but the prices were lower. So, but I don't know if it's state or federal, we're not allowed to charge more than a convenience store.
Mr. Webster.
Yeah, quick follow-up on that. And I've heard this before, that we're not allowed to charge more than a convenience store, but the point is that I think she was trying to make to us, I talked to her after this little function as well, and, excuse me, if we're comparing prices to a convenience store versus comparing prices to Walgreens, or CVS, that's a world of difference. I mean, you go into, you know, the convenience store, the gas station at night there, and a box of cereal that you might buy at Schnucks for $1.79 is like $3.79 at the convenience store. So that was her point she's trying to make, is that that's still gouging people if that's what we're comparing our product price to.
Thank you very much, Mr. Webster. Appreciate that. Any other comments by board members before we move on? Mr. Booker, anything?
Thank you, Chairman. Just to add on to that, looks like our tablets are continuing to contribute to commissary and be a positive thing. So other than that, that concludes my report, Chairman.
Thank you very, very much. Next item of business, unfinished business. Next item of business, new business. Yes, Mr. Gurl.
Thank you, Chairman. If it would be appropriate, I would like to refer a matter over to operations, and that would be our drinking fountains in the administration building, which, if you have seen, are just disgusting. It does not showcase what Winnebago County is about. I don't think they should cost that much money, but if we can look into replacing those, I have a picture on my phone if anybody would like to see what they look like. I think it's awful. If someone came into the county wanting to do business, that is some of the first things that they may see on their way to the restroom is how bad the water tastes, how bad the water fountain looks. It's just awful. I know it seems small and petty, but really in the big scheme of things, if you want to show excellence everywhere and you know what we're about, I think the front door entrance should be what it should be about. That's part of it. Thank you.
So if I'm hearing you right, maybe what we'll do is two things if it's okay. Number one, we'll get an update next, but we'll talk internally and have somebody on the operations side take a look at that so there's an update on where we're at, where that might be going, and I'll just refer that to Carla. Thank you, Mr. Gurl. I'm sorry if I'm going out of order here. Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Something that came to mind, the ATM machine in the lobby of the administration building. For many years, there was no charge for Rockford Municipal Employees Credit Union to access that. And I've used it a few times and noticed myself that there are fees. And I don't know who I heard it from, but it seems to me I heard that the company that's providing it had mentioned or said, I don't know if it's contract language, that there wouldn't be no fees, but there are. So if someone can look at it, I mean, I use it regularly through my bank and there's a fee, but for a dozen years there wasn't.
Okay, we'll get an update to operations on that, and I'll just refer that to administration on that as well. Thank you very much. Mr. Webster.
Yeah, just two things real quick. One is following up on Bert's comments. Perhaps we, if anybody knows a good plumber, we could get one to look at those drinking cups. But secondly, though, the one thing that I've mentioned this before, I don't know why we can't keep those, you know, hand dispenser things full. You know what I mean? Especially we're all so much aware of colds and flu and all that stuff. And there's darn dispensers, they've never got anything in them. And I'm asking, can we put that in our budget to allocate $100 or so to fill those things up?
Thank you very much, Mr. Webster. We'll make a note of that as well. Appreciate it. I'll say this, it'll probably negate the need for closed session. I'll just say this, is that one of the things that I want to see the appropriate committee would probably be operations take a look at is that we absolutely need to be clear going forward. County board member emails are one thing, public, private, as long as they're FOIable. I want to make sure we're clear on our understanding and policy, but when it comes to employees at the county doing county business, entertaining county business, doing anything related to county business, related to professional staff, related to items with this government, it should be done only in one place. And I want to make sure we're clear on that, and if we need to develop a policy, we're absolutely clean and clear. I am extremely disheartened over some recent conversations, and I cannot pretend to not be, and this need not happen again. So if that's okay, we will perhaps take a look at that and have some policy discussions in the operations committee. I see two hands shot up. I don't know first, Mr. Fillers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question for HR here. Do we have policy on staff members using private emails for county level correspondence and communication.
Kim?
That policy is actually initiated out of our IT department, and there is an internet access policy already in place.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Salgado?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. In light of your comments, I do also recommend that we continue to push forward what was brought up with yourself and Tina McCall on the culture and values, but also our strategic plan. I believe if we would have those, I kind of talked to you about this, if we had those in place, we would be where we need to be or where we are now and with the ordinance that we earlier voted on. So I encourage us to continue. I hope that our culture internally in our board office continues to progress and not get any worse of such matters. Just making sure that we are all in this together and moving forward. Whatever decision was made, hopefully we can get clarification on your issue potentially on what does that mean for you as a chairman. Hopefully we can address that in the operations committee, but that's what I would like to see, and let's move forward on this and keep pushing our strategic plan. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate your comments on the Shared Valley Strategic Plan. It's like healthcare. Sometimes you got to pass it to see what's in it. Mr. Schultz. Got a motion.